In the hills south of San Jose, California, there stands a house that was never meant to be finished, the Winchester Mystery House. 160 rooms spread across what began as an 8-room farmhouse, staircases climbing toward ceilings they'll never reach, doors opening into walls or dropping 2 stories to gardens below, windows looking into other rooms instead of the outside world. Construction that continued without pause for 38 years, day and night, 7 days a week, stopping only when the woman who ordered it took her final breath. Sarah Winchester spent nearly 4 decades building a mansion with no master plan, no architect's vision, no end in sight. She employed workers around the clock. She changed her mind constantly, ordering rooms demolished and rebuilt, hallways sealed, staircases redirected. By the time she died in 1922, she had created something that shouldn't exist, a labyrinth that defies logic and seems designed to confuse anyone who enters. Some say she was trying to confuse the spirits of people killed by her family's rifles. Others believe she was simply drowning in grief so profound that it destroyed her mind. The truth is more complicated and far more tragic than either explanation. This is the story of how one of America's wealthiest women became its most haunted heiress. Not haunted by ghosts, but by guilt and loss so overwhelming that she spent her fortune and her life trying to escape what lived inside her own mind. Understanding Sarah Winchester requires understanding the weapon that made her family's fortune, and that weapon changed America forever. The story begins not in California, not in Connecticut where Sarah was born, but in the workshops and factories where American ingenuity transformed warfare and conquest. It begins with a rifle that would kill more people than any other weapon of its time, a rifle that won the West by making it possible for settlers to defeat anyone who stood in their way, a rifle that turned the Winchester name into a symbol of both progress and death. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company was founded in New Haven, Connecticut in 1866. Oliver Winchester, a successful shirt manufacturer, had invested in a struggling firearms company during the Civil War. The Volcanic Repeating Arms Company was producing innovative but flawed lever-action pistols and rifles. The design showed promise, but the ammunition was weak, the mechanisms unreliable. Winchester saw potential where others saw failure. He recognized that small improvements could transform a failing concept into a revolutionary product. He reorganized the company, brought in better engineers, secured patents, and focused on one goal: creating a rifle that could fire multiple shots without reloading. The result changed warfare and westward expansion forever. The Winchester Model 1866, often called the Yellow Boy because of its brass receiver that gleamed like gold in the sunlight, was the first commercially successful repeating rifle. Previous rifles required soldiers to reload after every shot. A man with a muzzle-loading rifle could fire maybe 3 rounds per minute if he was fast and well-trained. The Winchester held up to 15 cartridges in a tubular magazine beneath the barrel. A simple lever action ejected the spent cartridge and chambered a fresh round. One man with a Winchester could fire as many shots as 10 men with single-shot rifles. The lever moved smoothly, the action was reliable, and suddenly, warfare had changed. The impact was immediate and dramatic. The U.S. Army was slow to adopt repeating rifles, clinging to the belief that soldiers would waste ammunition if they could fire too quickly. Military doctrine still reflected the tactics of Napoleonic warfare, where massed formations fired in volleys. The idea of individual soldiers firing rapidly seemed wasteful and dangerous. Army procurement officers argued that soldiers couldn't be trusted with that much firepower. Better to give them single-shot rifles and train them in fire discipline. But civilians had no such hesitation. Ranchers understood what the Winchester meant. Settlers heading west knew what it could do. Lawmen recognized its advantages. Outlaws wanted it immediately. The Winchester became the rifle of choice for anyone heading into dangerous territory. It appeared on cattle drives, where a stampede or rustlers could strike without warning. It hung in the sheriff's office in every frontier town. It traveled in covered wagons alongside families heading to claim homesteads. It became as essential to Western expansion as the railroad, the telegraph, and barbed wire. The rifle that won the West wasn't just marketing copy. It was an accurate description of a weapon that made conquest possible on a scale that had previously been unimaginable. Native American tribes acquired Winchesters and used them against cavalry units still carrying single-shot carbines. The technological advantage shifted dramatically. A small group of warriors with Winchester rifles could hold off much larger military forces. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where Custer's entire command was wiped out, involved Native American warriors who had acquired repeating rifles, including Winchesters. The cavalry was outgunned by the people they were trying to subdue. The improved Model 1873 cemented the Winchester's legendary status. This was the gun that earned the nickname, the gun that won the West. More than 720,000 were produced over 50 years. It appeared in frontier towns hanging behind the bar. It rode on saddles during cattle drives. It sat loaded by doors in mining camps where claim disputes turned violent. It was used in range wars between cattlemen and sheep herders, between settlers and Native Americans, between law and outlaws. Theodore Roosevelt carried one on his ranch in the Dakota Territory. Buffalo Bill Cody endorsed it and performed trick shooting demonstrations that drew huge crowds. The Winchester became as much symbol of America as the flag itself. The rifle appeared in conflicts worldwide. Wherever there was violence, wherever territory was disputed, wherever people fought for control of land and resources, Winchester rifles showed up. They were used in the Spanish-American War. They appeared during the Philippine insurrection, where American forces fought to control territory seized from Spain. They turned up in revolutions across Latin America. They were shipped to Africa and Asia. Wherever Winchester rifles appeared, people died. And every rifle sold added to the Winchester family fortune. Oliver Winchester died in 1880, but the company continued to thrive under his son, William Wirt Winchester. Production expanded. New models were designed to meet different needs: larger calibers for hunting big game, smaller calibers for target shooting. Military contracts kept the factory running at capacity. The plant in New Haven employed thousands of workers. The factory ran constantly, 3 shifts a day, producing rifles that shipped across the country and around the world. Profits were enormous and growing every year. The Winchester family lived well. This was the Gilded Age, the decades after the Civil War, when American industrialists accumulated wealth that would dwarf modern billionaires. The Vanderbilts built railway empires. Rockefeller controlled oil. Carnegie dominated steel. These names made headlines and built palaces that stunned ordinary Americans. But families like the Winchesters also prospered spectacularly, quieter, but equally wealthy. They lived in grand estates in Connecticut. They traveled Europe for months at a time. They moved in the highest circles of American society, welcomed at the finest homes, invited to the most exclusive gatherings. Sarah Lockwood Pardee knew nothing of rifles or wealth when she was born in September 1839. She grew up in New Haven in a family of modest means. Her father, Leonard Pardee, was a carpenter and joiner, skilled with his hands but far from wealthy. He made a respectable living building furniture and doing construction work, but the family lived a simple life. Sarah was one of several children in a household where money was carefully managed and luxuries were rare. But Sarah was exceptional in ways that transcended her family's financial situation. She was educated beyond what was typical for women of her time. She attended the finest schools available in New Haven. She studied mathematics, literature, history, and languages. She spoke 4 languages fluently by the time she reached adulthood: English, French, Spanish, and Italian. This was extraordinary for any American woman in the mid-1800s, when most girls received only basic education focused on preparing them to be wives and mothers. Sarah played piano exceptionally well, with a skill that suggested hours of practice and natural talent. In a society that restricted women's opportunities severely, where careers were essentially closed to them and their roles were defined by marriage and family, Sarah cultivated the skills that mattered for someone of her class and gender. She couldn't become a doctor or lawyer or business owner, but she could become cultured, educated, accomplished in the feminine arts that made a woman attractive to potential husbands. She was reportedly quite beautiful, with delicate features and an air of refinement that set her apart. She stood barely 5 feet tall, small even by the standards of the time, but her presence commanded attention. She carried herself with confidence. She was intelligent and showed it in conversation. In a world where women were expected to be quiet and deferential, Sarah had a spark that people noticed. In September of 1862, at age 23, she married William Wirt Winchester. He was the only son of Oliver Winchester, heir to the growing firearms empire. William was 31, educated, and being groomed to eventually take over the family business. The marriage elevated Sarah into a world of privilege she had never known. The Pardis were respectable, but not wealthy. The Winchesters were becoming genuinely rich as rifle sales exploded. The couple moved into one of New Haven's finest homes, a substantial residence in a neighborhood where successful industrialists and their families lived. The house had servants, multiple parlors, formal dining rooms, all the trappings of upper-class Victorian life. Sarah had maids to help her dress, cooks to prepare elaborate meals, groundskeepers to maintain the property. She no longer had to worry about money or domestic labor. She had everything a woman of her time was supposed to want: a wealthy husband who treated her well, social position among Connecticut's elite, membership in the right churches and charitable organizations, invitations to the finest homes. She participated in the social life expected of her class. She attended charity events, hosted tea parties, called on the wives of other prominent families. Her piano playing became a feature at social gatherings where guests would gather around as she performed. She had fine clothes, jewels, opportunities to travel. By all visible measures, Sarah Winchester had achieved a perfect life. She seemed destined for comfortable decades as the wife of an industrialist, eventually the mother of children who would inherit wealth and position, a woman who would live out her years in the security that money provided. 4 years later, in July of 1866, everything collapsed. Sarah gave birth to a daughter. They named her Annie Pardee Winchester. The pregnancy had been normal. The birth went smoothly. The baby appeared healthy at first, but something was wrong. Within days, Annie began to fail. She wasn't growing properly. She wasn't gaining weight. She wasn't nursing well. The condition was called marasmus, a wasting disease that doctors barely understood in the 1860s. Infants simply failed to thrive. They grew weaker each day, despite care and feeding. There was no treatment, no cure. Nothing doctors could do except watch and wait and hope the child would somehow recover. Annie lasted exactly 15 days. On July 25, 1866, the baby who was supposed to fill their lives died in Sarah's arms. The cause of death was listed as marasmus, which wasn't really a diagnosis so much as a description. The baby wasted away. Why? No one knew. Nutrition science barely existed. Pediatric medicine was primitive. Infant mortality was high in the 1860s, but that statistical reality offered no comfort to a mother holding her dead child. Sarah was devastated. Friends and family members who saw her in the weeks and months after Annie's death reported a complete transformation. The vibrant young woman who had entered the Winchester family disappeared, replaced by someone broken by grief. She withdrew from social activities that had once filled her calendar. She stopped attending church regularly. She avoided gatherings where other young mothers would be present with their healthy babies. She dressed in black for years, mourning clothes that Victorian society expected, but that Sarah wore with an intensity that worried people who knew her. The grief never lifted. Most people who lose a child eventually find a way to move forward, not forgetting, but finding a path through the pain to something resembling normal life. Sarah couldn't do it. The loss hung over her like a shadow that darkened everything. William tried to help, tried to comfort her, tried to interest her in activities that might provide distraction. Nothing worked. The house that should have been filled with children remained empty and quiet. Sarah wandered the rooms in black dresses, a ghost haunting her own life. 15 years passed. Sarah remained childless. The couple never tried for another baby. Some historians speculate that the trauma of losing Annie made the idea unbearable. The thought of risking that kind of pain again, the terror of going through another pregnancy knowing it might end the same way, was simply too much. Others suggest medical complications from Annie's birth or death prevented further pregnancies. Birth injuries were common in the 19th century and often led to lifelong health problems for women. Whatever the reason, Sarah and William Winchester lived in a large house designed for a family, but occupied by only 2 people and their servants. The rooms echoed. The nursery stayed closed. Then, in March of 1881, William began showing symptoms of tuberculosis. The disease was common in the 19th century and almost always fatal. It attacked the lungs, causing coughing, weakness, fever, and a slow wasting away that earned it the nickname consumption. Patients consumed away over months or years while doctors watched helplessly. There was no cure. Treatments were mostly useless. Fresh air and rest and hope that somehow the patient's body would fight off the infection. It rarely worked. The bacteria that caused tuberculosis wouldn't be identified until 1882, a year after William died. Antibiotics that could treat it wouldn't exist until the 1940s. In 1881, a diagnosis of tuberculosis was essentially a death sentence. William wasted away just like their daughter had. He coughed constantly. He grew weaker each week. He lost weight until he barely resembled the strong, healthy man he had been. Sarah watched her husband die slowly, helpless to do anything except sit with him and wait for the inevitable. William Winchester died on March 7, 1881. He was 43 years old. Sarah was 41. In the span of 15 years, she had lost her only child and her husband. She was left completely alone. The inheritance made her one of the wealthiest women in America. William's estate was valued at over $20 million, an almost incomprehensible sum equivalent to more than $500 million in modern currency. Sarah received approximately half of that immediately, over $10 million that she could spend however she wished. More importantly, she inherited a 50% ownership stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The company was producing thousands of rifles per year. Demand remained strong. The American West was still being settled. Conflicts continued. Sales were robust and growing. Sarah's stake generated approximately $1,000 per day in income, equal to about $26,000 daily in modern currency. Do the math. That's roughly $365,000 per year, every year, without Sarah doing any work at all. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking about income of near $10 million annually. For the rest of her life, money would flow into her accounts without pause. She could spend freely and never worry about running out. She could maintain multiple properties, employ dozens of servants, travel anywhere, purchase anything, and the money would keep coming. Sarah Winchester would never need to work, never need to budget, never need to restrict her spending in any way for the rest of her life. But the money meant nothing to her. She had lost everyone she loved. Her daughter was dead. Her husband was dead. She had no children to raise, no husband to care for, no family that needed her. Her parents were deceased. Her siblings had their own lives. Sarah was adrift in a mansion in Connecticut, surrounded by servants and silence, with wealth she never wanted and grief she couldn't escape. The rooms where Annie should have been playing remained empty. The bedroom she had shared with William held only memories. The house was a tomb filled with ghosts of the life she was supposed to have. Friends noticed her deteriorating mental state. She became obsessed with death, with the afterlife, with the question of what happened to Annie and William. Where were they? Did they still exist somewhere? Could she reach them? These questions consumed her. She lost weight. She slept poorly. She wandered the house at night. People who visited reported that she seemed disconnected from reality, lost in thoughts no one else could follow. She would be speaking and then trail off mid-sentence, staring at nothing. She would forget conversations moments after having them. She was unraveling. This was not unusual for the time. The late 1800s saw an explosion in spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate with the dead. Spiritualism had emerged in the 1840s when 2 young sisters in upstate New York claimed they could hear rapping sounds from spirits. The Fox sisters became famous, demonstrating their abilities to packed audiences. Other mediums emerged, claiming their own connections to the spirit world. The movement grew rapidly and attracted followers from all levels of society. The Civil War accelerated spiritualism's growth dramatically. The massive death toll from that conflict, over 600,000 soldiers killed, left countless families desperate for contact with lost loved ones. Mothers wanted to reach their dead sons. Wives wanted messages from their husbands. Brothers and sisters and friends and lovers all wanted to believe that death wasn't the end, that communication was possible, that somehow the people they loved still existed somewhere. Mediums claimed they could serve as channels between the living and the dead. They held séances in parlors and meeting halls. Attendees would gather around a table in a darkened room. The medium would go into a trance. Spirits would communicate through rapping sounds, through automatic writing, through voices speaking through the medium's mouth. Messages came from the other side. Dead relatives shared information that only they could know. Skeptics dismissed it as fraud, but believers were convinced. Seances became fashionable entertainment in upper-class homes. Wealthy families would hire mediums to perform at parties. Guests would thrill at the mysterious communications, the tables that moved on their own, the voices from beyond. Even Mary Todd Lincoln held seances in the White House after her son Willie died during the Civil War. President Lincoln attended at least one, though he remained skeptical. If the First Lady believed in spiritualism, then it had legitimacy in society's highest circles. The movement attracted both sincere believers and obvious frauds. Some mediums were exposed using tricks, accomplices hidden in walls, mechanical devices that created sounds and movements, tables lifted by hidden wires, voices produced by accomplices speaking through tubes, photography tricks using double exposure to create ghost images. The methods were often clever, and believers wanted so badly for it to be real that they overlooked evidence of fraud. Other mediums seemed genuinely convinced of their abilities. They passed tests. They provided information they shouldn't have known. Whether they were actually communicating with spirits or using psychological techniques and lucky guesses, they believed in what they were doing. The question of authenticity mattered less than the comfort these sessions provided to grieving people. Sarah Winchester reportedly visited a medium in Boston, though the details remain disputed by historians. Some accounts place the visit in 1884. Others question whether it happened at all. The story that emerged, whether true or embellished or completely invented over time, became the foundation of the Winchester Mystery House legend. According to this account, Sarah traveled to Boston specifically to consult a famous medium whose name has been lost to history. She sought answers about Annie and William. She wanted to know if they were at peace. She wanted to know if she would see them again. The medium, so the story goes, went into a trance and made contact with William Winchester's spirit. The message was terrifying. The medium claimed that a curse followed the Winchester family. The spirits of everyone killed by Winchester rifles, thousands upon thousands of souls, were seeking vengeance. They had taken Annie as punishment for the blood money the family had accumulated. They had taken William for the same reason. Now they were coming for Sarah. The curse wouldn't end until she died, just like her husband and daughter. But there was a way to escape, the medium supposedly said. Sarah had to leave Connecticut immediately. She had to move west, as far from New Haven as possible. She must buy a house and begin building. The construction could never stop. As long as hammers struck and saws cut, as long as rooms were being added and hallways extended, the spirits would be confused, unable to find her among the constantly changing architecture. They would search through corridors that led nowhere. They would open doors that revealed only walls. They would climb staircases that ended at ceilings. They would wander lost through the labyrinth she created. But if construction ever ceased, even for a single day, the spirits would know. They would find her, and she would die just like her husband and daughter. Did this actually happen? We'll never know for certain. Sarah never publicly discussed any visits to mediums. No contemporary accounts mention such a consultation. The story emerged decades later, passed down through servants and construction workers, elaborated and embellished with each retelling. It has the feel of legend rather than verified history. But whether Sarah actually received this message from a medium, or whether grief and isolation led her to this conclusion herself, the result was the same. Whether someone told her to build, or whether she arrived at the idea on her own, looking for purpose or meaning or a way to fill the enormous void in her life, it doesn't really matter. The outcome was identical. In 1884, 3 years after William's death, Sarah left Connecticut. She abandoned the house where Annie had died and where she had watched William waste away from tuberculosis. She couldn't stay there surrounded by memories. She traveled across the country by train to California's Santa Clara Valley. California in the 1880s was still relatively new territory for wealthy Americans. Most East Coast families summered in Newport or traveled to Europe. California was frontier, rough and undeveloped, but that's exactly what Sarah wanted. Distance from Connecticut, distance from her old life, distance from everything familiar. She was searching for a place to build. What she found was an 8-room farmhouse on 161 acres south of San Jose. The property belonged to a Dr. Caldwell, who was selling off some of his holdings. It sat in an area of orchards and farms with clear views of the Santa Cruz Mountains. The house was unremarkable. A 2-story wood frame structure, the kind of place a successful farmer or small-town doctor might own. It had basic amenities, enough rooms for a family, a pleasant location, but nothing special. For Sarah, it was perfect, not because of what it was, but because of what it could become. Sarah purchased it for approximately $18,000. For a woman with her resources, that was essentially pocket change. She could have bought the finest mansion in San Francisco or built a new estate from scratch. But she didn't want something finished. She wanted something she could work on. She wanted a project. Then she did something that baffled everyone who knew her. She hired a construction crew and told them to start building. No architect was consulted. No detailed plans were drawn up. No blueprints existed showing what the final structure should look like. Sarah would tell the workers what she wanted, and they would build it. The work would continue 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without interruption. Workers would be organized into shifts so that hammers and saws never stopped making noise. When one crew finished their hours, another would take over immediately. Sarah would pay whatever was necessary to keep construction going constantly. The project began modestly enough. Sarah added rooms to the existing farmhouse, a bedroom here, a parlor there, a dining room extension. The workers were skilled carpenters and craftsmen who had built many houses before. This seemed like a normal, wealthy widow expanding a property to suit her needs. But they quickly learned that nothing was normal about this job. Sarah couldn't leave anything alone. She would observe construction for days, examining every detail, and then suddenly change her mind about the entire design. "Tear that down," she would say. "Build it differently. The room you just completed needs to be demolished and rebuilt with the windows in different locations." The workers learned that nothing was permanent at the Winchester House. A room completed last week might be demolished this week to make way for something else. A hallway they had framed and finished might be ordered sealed, and a new hallway built in a completely different direction. Staircases they had constructed might be torn out and rebuilt at a different angle or with a different number of steps. It was maddening work in some ways, but the pay was excellent and steady, and Sarah was always polite and respectful, even when her requests made no architectural sense whatsoever. Sarah developed a pattern that would continue for 38 years. Each evening, as sunset approached, she would retire to a room that came to be called the Blue Room. It was a small space, simply furnished with a table and chairs, lit by candles or later by electric lights. She would lock the door from the inside and remain there for hours, sometimes until dawn. Servants working elsewhere in the house reported hearing her talking, though she was alone. The sounds would carry through the walls, a voice asking questions, pausing as if listening to responses, then continuing. It was one side of a conversation, but no other voice could be heard. The official explanation, the story that spread among the workers and servants, was that Sarah held nightly séances in that room. She was communicating with spirits who gave her instructions for the next day's construction. The spirits would tell her what to build, where to add rooms, which hallways to seal, what changes to make. She would emerge each morning with new plans, often sketched roughly on paper or simply described verbally to the waiting construction foreman. Build a staircase here that climbs partway, then turns back on itself. Add a door there that opens into a wall. Install a window that looks into another room instead of outside. The workers did exactly as instructed, even when the instructions made absolutely no sense from any normal architectural perspective. Whether Sarah actually believed she was speaking with ghosts, or whether these sessions were simply how she processed her grief and made decisions in isolation, the result was the same. The house grew in ways that defied conventional architecture. Rooms were added without considering how they connected logically to existing structures. Hallways twisted in strange directions that made navigation confusing. The layout became increasingly labyrinthine as construction continued year after year. Sarah was particularly obsessed with the number 13. This fixation appeared throughout the house in ways that couldn't be coincidental. Windows in some rooms had exactly 13 panes of glass, arranged in patterns that required custom construction. Certain rooms had 13 wall panels where 12 or 14 would have been more natural. Staircases had 13 steps when 12 or 14 would have brought someone to the next floor more logically. Some light fixtures were designed with 13 candle holders or 13 bulbs. Hooks for hanging items were installed in rows of 13. Some sources claim she designed rooms with 13 windows or 13 doors, though this detail may be exaggerated by later storytelling. What's certain is that the number took on enormous significance in her mind. Was it lucky? Unlucky? Did it have spiritual meaning? She never explained, and the workers learned not to ask questions. Architectural features appeared that served no obvious purpose, beyond confusing anyone trying to navigate the house. A staircase would climb toward the ceiling, the steps built normally at first, then simply stop at a solid ceiling with no door or opening. Workers would build it exactly as Sarah specified, knowing it led nowhere, but following her instructions precisely because that's what they were paid to do. The stairs existed, solid and well constructed, climbing up to nothing. Doors opened to reveal solid walls just inches beyond the threshold. You could turn a doorknob, swing open a door, and find yourself staring at a wall. Not a room beyond, not a hallway, just a flat wall. Why build a door there? No one knew. Sarah ordered it, workers installed it, and there it remained. Other doors were even stranger. They opened to drops of 10 or 15 feet to gardens below. No railings, no steps, no warning signs, just an opening that would kill or seriously injure anyone who walked through carelessly. Servants learned which doors were safe to open and which were dangerous. They memorized the layout, warned new workers, and navigated carefully through a house that seemed designed to trap or harm the unwary. Windows were installed in locations that made no sense. Instead of looking outside to gardens or views, they looked into other rooms. You could stand in one bedroom and look through a window into a hallway or into another bedroom. The glass was real, the frames properly constructed, but the window served no normal purpose. It was another confusing element in an increasingly confusing house. Secret passages wound through the mansion. A door disguised as a wall panel would open if you knew where to push, revealing a narrow hallway leading to another section of the house. Some passages were so tight that only someone of Sarah's small stature could navigate them comfortably. A full-grown man or even an average-sized woman would have to turn sideways to squeeze through. Were these meant to help her escape if spirits finally found her? Or were they simply a manifestation of paranoia, a need to have hidden routes to anywhere in the house? No one knows. Rooms were built and then sealed permanently. Workers would construct an entire bedroom or sitting room, complete with wallpaper, furnishings, light fixtures, everything needed for the space to be used. Then, Sarah would order it closed. They would brick up the entrance, sealing it so thoroughly that the room became completely inaccessible. Sometimes they would build false walls in front of the sealed entrance so the room's existence wasn't even obvious. Why? Sarah never explained her reasoning. The sealed rooms remained hidden, frozen in time, complete but forever unused. One particularly strange feature was a staircase designed with steps only 2 inches high. It took 44 steps to climb just 9 feet vertically. The rise was so gradual that it felt more like walking on a ramp than climbing stairs. Each step was so shallow that you barely noticed you were ascending. Some historians suggest this was built to accommodate Sarah's severe arthritis in later years. As she aged and her joints deteriorated, climbing normal stairs became painful. This incredibly shallow staircase allowed her to reach the second floor without straining. Others point to it as evidence of her deteriorating mental state, a staircase built by someone who had lost touch with normal architectural principles and was designing based on dreams or spirit voices rather than practical considerations. The house sprawled outward in every direction. What began as 8 rooms expanded to 40, then 80, then more than 100. The structure grew like a living thing, adding wings and towers and extensions that made the original farmhouse unrecognizable. Sarah purchased adjacent land as needed to accommodate the expansion, eventually controlling 161 acres of property. The main structure consumed the original farmhouse entirely. Visitors couldn't tell where Dr. Caldwell's modest house ended and Sarah's additions began. It was all one massive, chaotic mansion that seemed to have grown organically rather than being designed by any human mind. By the 1890s, the Winchester House had become famous throughout California. Newspapers wrote articles about the eccentric widow who built constantly without apparent plan or purpose. The San Jose Mercury and other local papers ran stories speculating about her motives. Was she crazy? Was she trying to confuse ghosts? Was she just so wealthy that spending millions on endless construction meant nothing to her? Locals would drive past slowly, trying to catch glimpses of the growing structure through the trees and gardens. The mansion became a curiosity, a roadside attraction before such things were common. People pointed it out to visitors. There's the Winchester House where that crazy rich widow builds day and night. Sarah rarely appeared in public. She maintained accounts at stores in San Jose, but sent servants to do her shopping. She attended church occasionally, but sat alone and left quickly after services. She employed a substantial staff, but kept them at emotional distance. She had cooks, maids, groundskeepers, drivers, personal assistants, all the servants that a woman of her wealth would require. But she didn't develop friendships with them. She gave orders, they followed them, and that was the extent of the relationship. She had no close friends in San Jose. No one visited for tea or dinner. The house that could accommodate dozens of guests never hosted parties or social gatherings. Her entire existence revolved around the mansion and its endless construction. She did maintain some minimal connection to the outside world. She traveled occasionally, taking trips to San Francisco or even back to Connecticut, though these became less frequent as years passed. When she traveled, she sought out architectural ideas, visiting homes and buildings to observe features she might incorporate into her mansion. She would return with sketches or descriptions, ordering workers to recreate elements she had seen. A decorative window from a San Francisco mansion, a door style from a Connecticut estate, a staircase design from a hotel. The house became a jumbled collection of styles and features from across the country, assembled without coherent vision into an ever-expanding maze. She kept track of her finances carefully, despite her obsessive focus on construction. She wasn't so lost in grief or madness that she abandoned practical concerns entirely. She reviewed account statements, authorized payments to contractors, and ensured that construction costs never exceeded her available resources. The income from the Winchester Company continued generating roughly $1,000 per day, an enormous sum that would have supported most wealthy families comfortably. But construction costs at their peak ran approximately $1,500 per day. The difference came from Sarah's initial inheritance, which was large enough to sustain the deficit for decades. Workers were paid well by the standards of the time. Skilled carpenters in the 1890s typically earned $1.50 to $2 per day. Sarah paid $3 per day and sometimes more for specialists who could do decorative work or handle complex projects. She understood that keeping good workers required fair compensation. The men who worked for her stayed for years, many for decades. They became accustomed to her odd requests, learning not to question why she wanted certain things built in certain ways. Their job was to follow instructions, build what she specified, collect their excellent pay, and return the next day ready to build something else or tear down what they had just finished if she had changed her mind overnight. The house kept growing. 7 stories tall at its peak before the 1906 earthquake reduced it, though only 4 stories remain standing today. Rooms stacked on rooms in configurations that would never pass modern building codes. hallways that turned back on themselves creating loops, staircases that climbed up one tower and descended another, returning you nearly to where you started. The layout defied comprehension. Even workers who had been there for years could get lost in sections they rarely visited. Sarah moved through this maze constantly, her small figure in black dresses appearing in different parts of the mansion at different times, observing construction, checking details, making notes for future changes. She never slept in the same bedroom 2 nights in a row. This became one of her most peculiar habits, and one that workers discussed among themselves in whispered conversations during breaks. She had dozens of bedrooms to choose from, each furnished and ready for use. But she rotated through them unpredictably, never following a pattern that anyone could discern. Some nights she would sleep in the main wing, other nights in a tower room, sometimes in a small bedroom tucked away in a corner of the mansion. Servants had to search the house each morning to find where she had spent the night. They would look for signs, an unmade bed, clothing left out, any indication of which room she had occupied. Was this to confuse spirits who might be hunting her? That's the story that developed among the staff. If she never slept in the same place twice, then the vengeful ghosts couldn't predict where to find her. They would search through bedroom after bedroom, always one step behind, never able to corner her in her sleep. Or was it the behavior of someone so paranoid and mentally unstable that staying in one place felt dangerous? Both explanations are possible. Both might be true. Sarah may have believed she was dodging spirits while actually acting out her own psychological disintegration. April 18, 1906, brought an event that seemed to confirm Sarah's worst fears, or at least that's how she interpreted it. At 5:12 in the morning, the San Francisco earthquake struck. The massive quake, estimated at magnitude 7 devastated San Francisco and was felt strongly throughout the Bay Area. San Jose, about 50 miles south of the city, experienced violent shaking that toppled chimneys, cracked foundations, and damaged structures throughout the town. The Winchester Mansion, 7 stories of additions built without conventional structural planning or proper engineering, swayed violently during the prolonged shaking. Chimneys collapsed, crashing through roofs and shattering on floors below. Windows shattered throughout the house, glass exploding inward in dangerous showers. Walls cracked, some severely enough that they would need to be demolished. The entire structure groaned and shifted, timbers creaking, plaster falling, furniture sliding across rooms. For a house built without regard for earthquake resistance in one of the most seismically active regions of North America, it's remarkable that the mansion didn't collapse entirely. Sarah was asleep in a bedroom on an upper floor when the shaking began. No one knows which bedroom she had chosen that night, one of her many rotating options. As the house lurched and swayed, a heavy piece of furniture, some accounts say it was an armoire while others claim it was a section of wall that partially collapsed, fell across the doorway, trapping her inside the room. She couldn't open the door to escape. The fallen object blocked it completely. She called for help, her voice likely drowned out by the sounds of destruction throughout the mansion, by chimneys toppling and windows breaking and walls cracking. Servants eventually heard her calling. They rushed to find her, but couldn't reach the door immediately. The shifting structure had jammed it in its frame. They worked to free her, either eventually removing the door from its hinges or breaking through a nearby wall. Accounts vary on the specific details. What's certain is that it took significant effort to extract her from the trapped room. They found Sarah, terrified, but physically unharmed. At 67 years old, she had survived a major earthquake in a structurally questionable building. She was lucky to be alive. The house, however, had suffered significant damage. The earthquake destroyed the top 3 stories almost entirely. What had been a 7-story structure became effectively a 4-story building. The top floors were so badly damaged that they couldn't be safely repaired. Chimneys had punched through roofs in multiple locations. Several rooms were complete losses. Their walls collapsed or so badly cracked that they would need to be torn down. The damage was extensive and expensive. For most property owners, the earthquake would have prompted careful evaluation of the structure, consultation with engineers, and a thoughtful rebuilding process focused on making the house more stable. Sarah saw it differently. The spirits had found her. After 22 years of building, after creating a labyrinth designed to confuse supernatural pursuers, they had finally tracked her down. They had attacked the house, bringing it down around her, trapping her in a room where she could have died. The earthquake wasn't a natural disaster. It was a message, a warning that she needed to do more, build more, create even greater confusion to protect herself. The spirits were getting closer. Her defenses had failed. Her response was immediate and revealing of her psychological state. She ordered workers to seal off the entire front section of the mansion. Rooms that had been completed, that she had been using regularly, were now declared off-limits. The front 30 rooms were to be closed permanently. Workers boarded up doors and windows from the inside. They cut off access to stairways that led to that section. They built walls blocking hallways. The entire front of the house, the part facing the road and visible to anyone passing by, was sealed, as if it had never existed. Why? Sarah believed the spirits had entered through the front. They had come in through the main entrance, through the formal front rooms, through the parts of the house that were most public and accessible. By sealing that entire section, she could trap them there, preventing them from reaching the rest of the mansion where she lived. The logic made sense only to someone whose grip on reality was slipping, whose fear had overwhelmed rational thought. She was walling off a third of her house to imprison ghosts that existed only in her mind. Construction resumed within weeks of the earthquake. The destroyed upper floors were not rebuilt to their previous height. Sarah decided the house should be shorter, perhaps believing that a lower profile would be less noticeable to the vengeful spirits she feared. But the fundamental project didn't change. The work never stopped. Workers cleared debris, repaired damage, and then continued adding new rooms and making modifications to existing spaces. If anything, the pace accelerated after the earthquake. Sarah became even more insistent about constant construction. Even minor changes required immediate attention. Paint that door tonight, move that window tomorrow, build a new hallway parallel to one that already exists. The workers obeyed as they always had. They had learned long ago not to question Sarah's instructions, no matter how strange. They were paid well, and the work was steady. If the rich widow wanted rooms built, then demolished, then rebuilt slightly differently, that was her business. Their job was to swing hammers and sawboards and collect their wages. By 1910, the mansion contained more than 160 rooms, though the exact count varied depending on how you defined a room. Some spaces were barely larger than closets, others were grand ballrooms. There were 47 fireplaces, many built and then sealed shut because Sarah decided she didn't want fire in that particular location. 2 ballrooms existed, though Sarah never hosted balls or social gatherings. She never entertained guests beyond the occasional visit from business advisors or attorneys handling her affairs. The rooms existed because she ordered them built, not because she had any practical use for them. The house included 40 staircases of varying designs and purposes. Some were conventional, connecting floors in normal ways. Others were architectural puzzles that seemed designed to confuse. That incredibly shallow staircase with 44 steps to climb just 9 feet vertically. Staircases that split halfway up, one branch leading to a functional room while the other terminated at a ceiling. Staircases enclosed in narrow shafts with barely enough room for one person to squeeze through. Staircases that climbed up and then came back down without actually providing access to anything useful. The windows numbered over 10,000, though the exact count remains disputed, because many were sealed behind walls when Sarah closed off sections of the house. Many windows were Tiffany art glass, expensive decorative pieces that Sarah purchased from the famous New York studio. Tiffany was one of the most prestigious names in decorative arts, and his stained glass was highly sought by wealthy collectors. Sarah bought multiple Tiffany windows, each costing hundreds or even thousands of dollars. But she would install a beautiful Tiffany window in a hallway where almost no one would see it, or in a room she then ordered sealed so the window became inaccessible, its beauty hidden behind a wall. The waste of valuable art bothered the workers, but they followed instructions. The house had 2,000 doors, according to most estimates. The exact number is hard to determine because sealed rooms contain doors that can't easily be counted. Most doors were conventional, connecting rooms in normal ways. but dozens of doors opened to solid walls, their handles turning and hinges swinging only to reveal plaster or wood blocking any passage. Other doors opened to dangerous drops to gardens 10 or 15 feet below, sudden voids that could kill anyone who walked through without looking. A few doors disguised secret passages that wound through hidden parts of the mansion. Servants learned which doors were safe and which were traps. They memorized the maze, guided visitors carefully when necessary, and passed knowledge down to new workers who joined the staff. Sarah's daily life became as peculiar as her house. She wore black constantly, mourning clothes for the husband and daughter she lost decades earlier. In Victorian society, mourning periods were prescribed. A widow might wear black for a year or two, then gradually transition to gray and purple, and eventually return to normal colors. Sarah never stopped mourning. 40 years after Annie's death, she still wore only black dresses. She was frozen in grief that never lifted, perpetually bereaved, locked in the emotional state of the days immediately following her losses. She was rarely seen outdoors during daylight hours. Neighbors occasionally spotted her in the gardens at night, a small figure in black walking alone among the plants and fountains. She cultivated extensive gardens on her property, areas of extraordinary beauty that she apparently enjoyed, but she preferred to experience them after dark when no one could observe her. During daylight, she stayed inside the mansion, moving through its corridors, observing construction, making her endless plans for modifications and additions. She communicated with servants primarily through written notes or brief verbal instructions. She avoided extended conversations whenever possible. Servants would receive notes telling them what tasks to complete that day. Cook this for dinner. Clean these rooms. Send someone to town for these supplies. The notes were specific and clearly written, evidence that despite her odd behavior, her mind remained sharp enough to manage a large household. But the personal distance was absolute. She didn't chat with servants about their families or lives. She didn't develop warm relationships with people who worked for her for decades. She remained isolated within her own home, surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. The nightly sessions in the Blue Room continued throughout the years. Some servants swore they heard multiple voices emanating from that locked room, though Sarah was the only person inside. Others insisted they heard only her voice and assumed she was praying or talking to herself. The sounds would carry through walls and doors, words that couldn't quite be made out, but the rhythms of conversation recognizable. Questions posed, pauses as if listening to responses, then more speaking. It was one side of a dialogue, but no second voice could ever be clearly heard by anyone listening outside the room. The truth remains unknown. What happened in that locked room during those long nightly sessions was Sarah's secret. Did she genuinely believe she was communicating with spirits? Quite possibly. This wasn't some uneducated person engaging in superstitious behavior. Sarah was intelligent, well-read, cultured, but she had also suffered losses that could break anyone's mind. Losing your only child is devastating. Losing your husband 15 years later while still grieving your daughter creates a cascade of trauma that many people couldn't survive psychologically. If spiritualism offered her an explanation for her suffering, if it provided comfort, or at least a framework for understanding why her life had gone so wrong, then it's entirely understandable that she embraced it. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the absolute peak of the spiritualism movement. Millions of educated, rational people believed in ghosts, in séances, in communication with the dead. Scientists investigated mediums seriously. Newspapers reported on supernatural phenomena without obvious skepticism. Universities studied paranormal claims. Believing in spirits wasn't fringe behavior in 1900. It was mainstream enough that even sophisticated people took it seriously. Sarah had suffered losses that made spiritual explanations attractive. If William and Annie still existed somewhere, if she could somehow reach them or at least receive their guidance, then her suffering had purpose. She wasn't alone. They were watching over her, communicating through her nightly sessions, providing instructions for the house that would protect her. Was she mentally ill by modern standards? Almost certainly yes, A woman who spends 38 years building a house with no coherent plan, who changes bedrooms every night out of fear, who seals rooms because of an earthquake, who interprets natural disasters as supernatural attacks, who avoids human connection while talking to empty rooms, would be diagnosed with severe anxiety disorder at minimum. Paranoid schizophrenia might fit. Delusional disorder could explain her fixed false beliefs about spirits hunting her. Post-traumatic stress disorder from losing Annie and William, combined with major depressive disorder from the extended grief, could account for her withdrawal and obsessive behavior. Modern psychiatry would have multiple diagnoses to offer. But we're talking about 1900, not 2024. Mental health treatment barely existed. The concept of therapy was in its infancy. Sigmund Freud was just beginning to develop psychoanalysis in Vienna. American psychiatry was primitive, focused mostly on managing severely ill patients in asylums rather than treating the kinds of anxiety and depression that affected Sarah. Medications didn't exist beyond sedatives like laudanum and morphine that caused more problems than they solved. Talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, the entire toolkit of modern mental health treatment, none of it was available. Sarah had wealth, which meant she could indulge her obsessions without anyone forcing her to stop. A poor woman behaving this way would have been institutionalized, locked away in an asylum where she might have died forgotten. But a wealthy widow, building a mansion on her own property, was eccentric, strange, a curiosity that people talked about, but no one had the power to stop. She wasn't hurting anyone but herself. She employed workers who were grateful for steady, well-paid jobs. She wasn't a danger to others, and wealth protected her from intervention that might have occurred if she had been middle class or poor. The question of guilt hangs over her entire story like a shadow. Winchester rifles had killed enormous numbers of people throughout the second half of the 19th century. Native Americans during the brutal Indian Wars that exterminated entire tribes and forced survivors onto reservations. Soldiers on both sides during the Spanish-American War and the Philippine insurrection. Civilians caught in range wars across the West where disputes over land and water rights turned violent. Outlaws gunning down lawmen, lawmen gunning down outlaws. The rifle that won the West had also caused tremendous bloodshed. Tens of thousands of deaths at minimum, possibly hundreds of thousands when you count all the conflicts worldwide where Winchester rifles appeared. Did Sarah feel responsible for this legacy of violence? Some historians argue that guilt over the Winchester rifle's deadly impact drove her obsession with building. The spirits she feared weren't abstract supernatural forces, but actual people killed by her family's weapons. The house was her attempt at atonement, a way to spend the blood money she inherited on something that would never end, an eternal penance for sins she hadn't personally committed, but that her wealth was built upon. The endless construction was her prison sentence, self-imposed, carried out in rooms and hallways instead of behind bars. This interpretation has a certain narrative appeal. It makes her story tragic in a classical sense. A woman destroyed not by her own actions, but by inherited guilt, crushed under the weight of her family's sins, spending her fortune in a futile attempt to somehow balance the moral scales. It resonates with modern sensibilities about the ethics of wealth built on violence and exploitation. But other historians dismiss this interpretation entirely. They point out that Sarah never expressed guilt publicly about the Winchester rifle or its impact. She didn't donate money to peace causes. She didn't fund hospitals for wounded soldiers or orphanages for children who lost parents to gun violence. She didn't try to limit Winchester rifle production or use her ownership stake to push the company in less militaristic directions. She accepted her dividend checks without protest. She lived comfortably on income generated by weapon sales. If guilt consumed her, she never said so explicitly in any surviving letters or documents. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these extremes. Sarah may not have consciously felt guilty about the Winchester rifle's deadly impact. She may never have connected her personal suffering to the suffering her family's weapons had caused. But subconsciously, deep in her mind where thoughts don't form into clear statements, the connection might have been there. She inherited enormous wealth built on a weapon designed to kill efficiently. Her comfortable life, her servants, her ability to build this massive mansion, all of it came from death. Her husband and daughter died young while she lived on, sustained by money that flowed from violence. The psychological weight of that reality, even if never consciously acknowledged, could drive someone to desperate, irrational behavior. Building became her escape from thoughts too painful to confront directly. Every room added, every hallway extended, every staircase constructed gave her a purpose. It filled the enormous void left by Annie's death and William's death. It gave her something to control in a life that had spiraled beyond her control when her daughter died at 15 days old. The activity of construction, the daily decisions about where to put windows and doors, the constant presence of workers taking orders and building according to her specifications, all of it provided structure and meaning that her life otherwise lacked. The tragedy is that the building never helped. The house grew larger, more complex, more bizarre year after year, but Sarah never found peace inside it. She never recovered from her losses. She simply created an elaborate prison for herself, spending decades and millions of dollars constructing rooms she would never use, hallways that led nowhere, staircases that climbed to nothing, exactly like her life after William and Annie died. Going through motions, filling time, creating activity, but never actually arriving anywhere meaningful. The years rolled forward relentlessly. 1900 became 1910, 1910 became 1920. Sarah aged, her arthritis worsening until walking became painful, her isolation deepening until she was almost completely cut off from the outside world. The house that was supposed to protect her became something else entirely. A monument to grief, a physical manifestation of a mind destroyed by loss, a maze built from suffering. Construction continued without pause through all those years. Workers showed up every day as they had for decades. Hammers struck nails, saws cut lumber. Rooms were built, modified, destroyed, and rebuilt according to Sarah's ever-changing instructions. She emerged from the blue room each morning with new plans, sketches drawn in her shaky handwriting, verbal instructions delivered in her quiet voice. The men who had worked for her since the beginning were old now themselves, their hair gray, their bodies worn from decades of physical labor. But the work never stopped. As long as Sarah was alive and paying wages, construction would continue. The fortune that had seemed unlimited began to show its limits by the 1920s. The daily income from Winchester stock had decreased significantly. The company faced increased competition from other firearms manufacturers. New rifle designs from competitors cut into Winchester's market share. The company was still profitable, but nowhere near its peak. Sarah's income dropped to around $250 per day, still substantial, but far less than the $1,000 she had received in earlier decades. She began cutting back on construction crews, fewer workers on each shift, less ambitious projects. The house was still growing, but more slowly, the pace finally slackening after nearly 4 decades. In September of 1922, Sarah Winchester went to bed in one of her many bedrooms. She was 83 years old. She had spent 38 years building the mansion. She had changed rooms thousands of times, rotating through bedrooms in patterns no one could predict. She had given orders for countless modifications, additions, demolitions, and reconstructions. She had filled a house with 160 rooms, yet lived in isolation, surrounded by empty spaces that echoed with ghosts only she could perceive. That night, September 5th, 1922, she died peacefully in her sleep. Heart failure, the attending physician noted. Her body simply gave out, worn down by age and arthritis and decades of stress. The construction stopped immediately. Not gradually, not over days or weeks as projects were completed. Immediately. Workers heard the news that Mrs. Winchester had died, and they set down their tools mid-task and walked off the job site. There was no one to give them instructions for tomorrow, no one to authorize their paychecks. The woman who had driven the construction for 38 years was gone, and without her, the project simply ended. The house was finished not because it reached completion, not because some master plan had finally been fulfilled, but because the person ordering the work was dead. Sarah left the property to her niece, Frances Marriott, in a will that distributed her remaining wealth among several relatives and charitable causes. The will specified that the house and its contents should be sold, with proceeds added to the estate for distribution. Francis looked at the property and realized immediately that no one would want it. The mansion was too strange, too impractical, too expensive to maintain. It couldn't function as a normal home. The sealed rooms, the doors to nowhere, the staircases to ceilings, all the bizarre features that Sarah had insisted on made it useless for anyone wanting to actually live there. The maintenance costs were staggering. Climate control alone in a structure that size, with its many windows and poor insulation, would bankrupt most families. The property taxes were substantial. A full staff would be needed just to keep the place from falling apart. The house sat empty for months while the estate searched desperately for a buyer. Real estate agents showed the property to potential purchasers who walked through in stunned silence, trying to understand what they were seeing. The doors to walls, the windows into other rooms, the staircases to nowhere. It was like touring the physical manifestation of someone's mental breakdown. Every bizarre feature was evidence of Sarah's deteriorating psychological state. People toured out of curiosity, but no one made serious offers. Eventually, investors purchased the property for a fraction of its construction cost. These weren't people who wanted to live there. They were entrepreneurs who recognized what it could become. Not a home, because no one could actually live there comfortably, but an attraction, a curiosity, a place people would pay to tour. They opened the Winchester Mystery House to the public in 1923, less than a year after Sarah's death. The timing was perfect. America in the 1920s was obsessed with spiritualism, ghosts, and haunted houses. Harry Houdini, the famous magician, was crusading against fake mediums, exposing their tricks in highly publicized campaigns. Séances remained popular entertainment at parties. Ghost stories were trending in magazines and books. The public was fascinated by the supernatural, eager to believe in life after death, hungry for any evidence that ghosts might be real. The Winchester Mystery House offered something that seemed authentic. Not a fake haunted house with hired actors jumping out at visitors. Not a carnival attraction with obvious tricks. But a real mansion built by a woman who had genuinely believed she was being haunted. A structure so bizarre that visitors could see the effects of her supernatural fears in every room. The owners marketed it brilliantly. They emphasized the spirits, the curse, the nightly séances. They told Sarah's story with dramatic embellishments, making her more haunted and tragic than she perhaps actually was. They called it America's Most Haunted House, even though no credible paranormal activity had ever been documented there. The marketing worked spectacularly. Thousands visited in the first years. Tour groups walked through the labyrinth, led by guides who pointed out doors to nowhere, staircases to ceilings, windows into other rooms. They told Sarah's story. The daughter who died at 15 days old, the husband who died of tuberculosis, the widow who spent decades building to confuse ghosts. They speculated about the sealed rooms and what might be inside. They discussed the number 13 and its significance. They allowed visitors to experience firsthand the strangeness of a house built by grief. The numbers grew year after year. Hollywood discovered the house in the 1930s and 40s, using it as a filming location and inspiration for horror movies. The Winchester Mystery House appeared in documentaries, television shows, books, and countless magazine articles. It became embedded in American pop culture, a fixture of roadside America, a place everyone had heard of even if they'd never visited. The house became a symbol of something larger than Sarah's personal tragedy. It represented the danger of wealth without purpose. Sarah had inherited money she never wanted, built from an industry she never chose, accumulated from deaths she never caused but benefited from nonetheless. She had no children to raise, no husband to support, no meaningful work to occupy her time or give structure to her days. The wealth that should have brought freedom instead became a cage. She could spend it endlessly on construction that served no purpose, employing workers to build rooms no one would use, hallways that went nowhere, staircases that climbed to nothing. She spent 38 years and millions of dollars creating something useless because she didn't know what else to do with resources she never wanted. The tragedy deepens when you consider what she might have accomplished with that fortune. Sarah Winchester was intelligent, well-educated, cultured, and wealthy enough to do literally anything. She could have founded hospitals that saved thousands of lives. She could have built schools that educated generations of children. She could have funded medical research that might have found cures for diseases that killed people like her daughter and husband. She could have supported artists and musicians, creating institutions that enriched culture for decades. She could have used her wealth to make an enormous positive impact on the world. Instead, she spent 38 years building rooms that served no purpose. She employed hundreds of workers over the decades, which did provide jobs and income for working families, but toward an end that benefited no one. The work itself was meaningless. Every room added, every modification made, brought her no closer to peace or happiness or relief from the grief that consumed her. The house never protected her from the spirits she feared because the spirits weren't outside. They were inside her mind, manifestations of grief and guilt and mental illness that no amount of construction could exorcise. Modern visitors walk through the Winchester Mystery House and see primarily a curiosity, a weird old mansion with staircases to nowhere. They take selfies in front of doors opening to walls. They laugh at the obvious impracticality of the design. They buy souvenirs in the gift shop, t-shirts and coffee mugs emblazoned with images of the house. They treat it as entertainment, as a fun, strange detour from the drive between San Francisco and San Jose. But they're walking through the physical remains of a woman's complete mental collapse. Every bizarre feature is evidence of Sarah's deteriorating psychological state over nearly 4 decades. The sealed rooms were desperate attempts to trap spirits that didn't exist. The doors to nowhere were defenses against supernatural threats that were never real. The constant construction was a desperate attempt to stay ahead of death itself, as if hammers striking and saws cutting could somehow prevent the inevitable. None of it worked. None of it could have worked. She died anyway, just like her husband, just like her daughter, just like everyone eventually does. The house didn't save her. It couldn't save her. It simply documented, in wood and glass and stone and plaster, the final decades of a life destroyed by loss. There are questions we can never answer with complete certainty. Did Sarah genuinely believe spirits were hunting her throughout all those years, maintaining that conviction from 1884 until her death in 1922? Or did she know on some level that she was using construction as therapy, a way to fill empty days with purpose, even if that purpose was artificial? Did the building project start as a genuine attempt to confuse spirits and gradually become simply what she did, a habit continued for decades, because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness of her life? Did she feel guilt over the Winchester rifles and the thousands of deaths they caused? Or was the medium story invented later by others to explain behavior that had simpler psychological roots in grief and mental illness? Was she trying to atone for her family's legacy of violence, or was she simply trying to survive the unbearable pain of losing everyone she loved? Was she mentally ill from the start, with Annie's death and William's death triggering something that was already present in her psychology, waiting for trauma to release it? Or did grief alone cause the breakdown we see in the historical record, demonstrating that even the strongest mind can shatter under enough loss? The evidence we have suggests a woman who experienced devastating trauma and never recovered. She lived in an era before effective mental health treatment existed. She had wealth that allowed her to indulge obsessions that a poorer person couldn't afford. She found in spiritualism an explanation for suffering that otherwise seemed random and meaningless, and she spent the rest of her life building a monument to that suffering. The Winchester Mystery House exists because a woman spent 38 years trying to escape something that lived inside her own mind. She couldn't build enough rooms to get away from it. She couldn't construct enough hallways to confuse it. She couldn't seal enough doors to lock it out. She couldn't climb enough staircases to rise above it. The thing haunting Sarah Winchester was her own grief, her own sense of loss, her own inability to move forward after her daughter and husband died. And in the end, when her heart finally gave out in September 1922, the spirits she feared had never come for her at all. There were no vengeful ghosts, no supernatural forces, no curse that needed to be confused by endless construction. She had built her own prison, one room at a time, one hallway at a time, one staircase at a time. She had spent a fortune creating a labyrinth she could never escape because the maze was never really in the house. It was in her mind. It had been there since Annie died at 15 days old. It deepened when William died of tuberculosis, and it trapped her completely, walling her off from human connection, from joy, from peace, from any possibility of moving forward. The hammers stopped. The workers left. The house stood exactly as it was at the moment of her death, frozen, incomplete, bizarre. A 160-room monument to what happens when wealth, grief, and mental illness collide without intervention. That's the real story of the Winchester Mystery House. Not a ghost story, though it's been marketed as one for over a century. Not a tale of supernatural forces, though Sarah may have believed in them. But something more frightening and more sad than either of those narratives. The story of a woman who had everything except the one thing she needed most: peace from the ghosts inside her own mind. Peace she never found, not in 38 years of building, not in millions spent on construction, not in the hundreds of rooms she created and never used. She died alone, still haunted, still afraid, still building even in her final years, trying until the very end to escape something that had always been inescapable because it lived within her.